Hey everyone, it is that time of year where everything is changing out on the prairies for the season. So why don't we go try and catch up with all the staff as they're out and about in the prairies. So Vivian, how did you come to learn about prairies?
Well, I studied them in school, but there's only so much studying you can do before, and you don't really fully understand the importance and the quality of prairie habitat. So when I came to work here at Litzinger, it was really my first interaction with prairie and with the ecology of prairies. So now that I'm immersed into the prairie life, it's just wonderful. I realize just how important this habitat is for such a wide variety of insects, wildlife, everything. And when you look at the ecology of prairie life, if you just see all these unique specialist bees, native insects, everything that rely on such specific habitat, it's nice to kind of walk around and see, these prairies are providing that for our native wildlife.
So Mary, when you hear the word prairie, what's that mean to you?
Prairie, okay. In the almost 20 years that I have been here, the prairie has changed dramatically. And I think that's what the prairie means to me, is a succession of plants, of animals, of insects, and so on. It used to be that we had a lot of tall goldenrod, and our volunteers, a lot of them will be viewing this, came out and we just took down as much tall goldenrod as we could because it was becoming very aggressive. We succeeded in that, and so when we succeeded in that, other areas of the prairie still had it. But over time, maybe within 2 years, the competition took that down. So I think me watching the fact that I don't have to worry a whole lot about the prairie is going to do what it needs to do to be successful, and it is very successful. Definitely progress. You can see behind me on the Joe Pye weed, all the insects and so on. If we just let nature do its thing and go through its succession the way it needs to, although we need people to come out and get the invasive species out, nature's going to come through. So I'd say the succession of plants over 20 years just amazes me, and 20 years is nothing for a prairie.
Hey Leslie, when you hear the word prairie, what does it make you think of?
What a great question, James. I think when I hear the word prairie, it makes me think of getting lost. I love to walk through the trails with the plants, super tall, and I'm in my own little world. It really kind of reminds me of when I used to go scuba diving. I know it's really crazy to kind of put those two together, but when you've got all your scuba equipment on and you're underneath the water and you're just in this completely new world and you can't really hear anything, you kind of zone, everything kind of just fades away and you're in this zone, but there's so much going on. That's kind of how I feel, and that's what the prairie makes me think of, because when I walk through the trails by myself especially, I can just get lost, but there is so much going on. It's just amazing. So you really do have to stop and look, and I can see pollinators all the time just busy and just going crazy. And so it's just a really peaceful feeling of just kind of getting lost in a space. So that's what I think of, and that's what prairie means to me.
So Adam, when you hear the word prairie, what do you think of?
So I was born and raised in Illinois, which is nicknamed the Prairie State. But if you'd asked me growing up what a prairie was, I would have thought of an overgrown lawn or maybe an old crop field that got overtaken by weeds. And it wasn't until much later in life as an adult where I realized that prairies were actually one of the most diverse and biologically productive ecosystems on the planet. And not only are they a critically important habitat for so many plant and animal species, but This is a system that humans have depended on for many thousands of years. So when I think of prairie, I think of all this rich diversity and these complex relationships and this huge part of our natural heritage that often goes underappreciated.
So Bob, when you hear the word prairie, what does it make you think of?
In some ways, prairies are kind of one of my connections to St. Louis. I grew up in Massachusetts, where prairies were this far-off, distant thing. Back in elementary school, kind of a Laura Ingalls Wilder thing. But when I moved out here, I was a teacher. Actually, before I started working here, was a teacher partner at Litzinger. Brought my kids out. We investigated the prairie, so it was one of my first connections with St. Louis. Now it's a very cool ecosystem, great support for pollinators, and always a fun prairie burn every year. So it's become part of my St. Louis life.
So you got to investigate it right alongside the kids.
Yep.
That's awesome.
New for me and new for them.
Hi, volunteers. So James asked me what I think of when somebody mentions prairie. This is one of my favorite spots right here, because this has the prairie dock, which has this really, really big leaf. This leaf isn't quite as big as it usually gets, but then right next to it is the Illinois bundle flower. And I just love to show the difference to kids in the leaf sizes. And then look at these cool seeds. I just think the seeds of the prairie are just so fascinating. The different shapes, the different colors. Like right now, we've got a lot of yellow. But then we're going to be getting into all my favorite colors, the purple, which is like my color, because I was born in February. Purple's my color. And I just really love the textures, the feel, the height, because when you go to the pasture prairie, which is where we are, the plants are so much taller than the North Prairie and the South Prairie. I know a lot of you have not come out for our Explore LREC walks, but you've got to get out here, especially now that the weather's getting a little bit cooler, and just walk around, because you guys don't get to come out here at this time of the year. I mean, normally we would be out here with kids, but there's no kids, just us big kids in orange. And we really miss you, and just love to just take a walk around. So email me, give me a call, let me know if you're gonna come out. Love to see you. Miss you all. Bye.
Hey James, what do you think of when you hear the word prairie? I'm so glad you asked, James. Well, I am not sure I can add much more to what everyone else has said. All I think I can add is that when I think of prairie, I think of home. I think of life. We don't have enough prairie left anymore. The Missouri Prairie Foundation says here in Missouri that less than 0.1% of prairies still exist, remnant prairies. So to me, I just think of something just so valuable, of so importance. Like I said, life. These little fragments of habitat are so important. So many different types of wildlife. I just can't help but think of them and what they are missing. And places like Litzinger, and we're reconstructing prairies. We're trying to add that little bit of life back into Missouri. So adding a little bit of life back into the state, to our home. Take, for instance, just the important things that are happening on the prairies right now. The monarchs are refueling on asters and goldenrods and sunflowers for their long migration back to Mexico. The ruby-throated hummingbirds are refueling for their long trip. The goldfinches are out by the hundreds out in the prairie right now, eating lots of seeds, getting ready for their trip. And the same for the dragonflies, just out in large swarms above the prairie, catching as many mosquitoes and other insects as they can for their trip. And then think about all the queen bumblebees. Next year's queens are out on the prairies right now collecting nectar so they can overwinter and grow their colonies next year. Just so much relies on having big open grassland settings. I hope more people will start to see that importance, but it's hard for them to see that when they aren't around prairies. Just trying to communicate and educate people on the importance of these plants and this type of habitat is what's important to me and what I think of when I hear the word prairie. I think of life. We are all interested in what all of you think the word prairie means to you, what you think of when you hear that word. So please email Martha at the email I'm gonna pop up on the screen. Boop. And you can either type it out, your response, or you can maybe email us a link to a video if you want to record yourself, and we'll share your thoughts in a future video. So we look forward to that. We look forward to hearing what prairie means to you guys, and we'll talk to you soon. Hope you guys have a great weekend.
Wow, look at this. Another lovely morning out on our prairies. Got flowers a-blooming, insects a-buzzing, and birds a-chirping. And other than the anthropogenic noises in the background, some would say this appears to be a pretty peaceful scene. However, it is important to remember that all the plants here you see are living organisms, all competing for the same resources. So things like sunlight, water, soil nutrients, even access to pollinators. Every single plant is in a constant fight with every other plant around it for these same resources. And these open grassland habitats can be particularly aggressive, and you see everything looks like it's kind of growing on top of each other. And a few plants have developed unique ways to adapt to this level of competition by living as parasites, essentially exploiting their neighbors. And today I'm going to talk about a few of them with you. So here's the first plant I want to talk about today. This is called swamp betony, or swamp lousewort, Pedicularis lanceolata. It has these odd almost tube-like cream-colored flowers and these kind of bluntly toothed leaves that are pretty distinct among other plants around here. And this is what's known as a hemiparasite. So as you can see, there is a lot of green tissue on it, which means it contains chlorophyll, so it is able to use sunlight for photosynthesis to produce sugars and energy for growth. But it also has these specialized structures on its roots called haustoria that will actually penetrate the roots of nearby plants, usually grasses, but sometimes other flowers and forbs. And it digs into those roots and can actually steal nutrients from them, essentially just mooching off its neighbors, which is a pretty clever adaptation to these dense grassy habitats where the growth can get really thick and it can be hard to compete for resources with these taller plants. So it's kind of a work smarter, not harder approach. But you gotta do what you gotta do, I guess. There is another betony that we have here, the wood betony, Pedicularis canadensis, which looks and functions similar to this one, but it only shows up like early to mid-spring. And both of those are in the broom rape family, the Orobanchaceae, which are kind of known for having these parasitic relationships. Another member of that family you might be familiar with is the scarlet paintbrush or the Indian paintbrush. Kind of low-growing plants that have the bright red or yellow flowers in the spring. So, same family, also hemiparasites. So here's another plant moocher you'll see along the edges of our prairies and trails here. See all these creamy colored buds and these big showy pinkish flowers that almost look like penstemon. So this is the slender false foxglove, Agellinus tenuifolia. It's another hemiparasite in the broom rape family, same as the betonies and paintbrushes. It has these leaves for photosynthesizing and also uses those root haustoria to parasitize its neighbors. And this one is actually an annual, so each individual flower is pretty short-lived and it needs to reseed itself every year to persist. So our third parasite is lurking in here. Doo-doo. Doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. So this plant is commonly called dodder or scaldweed. Species can be kind of hard to tell apart, so I'm not really going to bother with that right now, especially since it's not flowering. But it's in the genus Cuscata. It's a very unique member of the morning glory family, the Convolvulaceae. So it's closely related to your sweet potatoes and morning glory flowers. And unlike the last two plants, this one is an obligate parasite or a hollow parasite. So this one cannot do photosynthesis at all on its own. It's entirely reliant on its host plant, which in this case is wingstem. And it uses these root haustoria. You can see those. This kind of tentacle-like protrusions out of the stem that are inserted into the stem tissue of the host to extract nutrients. So while this thing is actively growing, it has these kind of stringy orange stems that look like someone dumped leftover spaghetti all over your garden. Then later in the year, about this time, they start flowering. These are all flower buds right here. And those flowers will get pollinated, the seeds will form, and the seeds will drop down to the soil. And then the following year they will germinate and start crawling up the stem of the host plant. And then eventually the lower part of the stem will die. So these things live kind of like epiphytes, without any roots attaching them to the ground, just kind of clinging onto their host.
Oh man, it's not allowed to be autumn already.